Hi, I'm Jenny Sue, and I'm presenting Polynesian languages. So first, we're going to take a look at the map. If you've seen some of my other videos, you'll know that I like utilizing maps just so we can visualize what we're going to talk about. So the area of Polynesia is really expansive. It's in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And to the west, you'll see there's the areas of Micronesia and Melanesia. Now, since we're talking about islands spread out across the ocean, there's not really strict borders, right? Instead, we have these kind of dotted lines that roughly tell us where these areas are. And because of that, we actually have some outliers in each area. You'll see that Kiribati is actually in both Micronesia and Polynesia, but Kiribati is actually a Micronesian nation. And even in Micronesia, we have some Polynesian outliers within Pohnpei. So Polynesia means many islands. And people usually refer to this area as a Polynesian triangle, with Hawaii as the most northern point, Rapa Nui or the Easter Islands to the east, and then New Zealand to the west. Polynesia consists of 6 independent countries and a whole bunch of other territories or dependencies and other types of political relationships I don't really understand too much, but it's something to do with the history, like colonization and wars. So we know Hawaii, for instance, is a US state, and American Samoa is a part of the US. It's a territory, but they are Polynesian islands. We have France, Chile, New Zealand, Australia, the UK, and Fiji also having some kind of claim to some Polynesian islands. So for Polynesian settlement, we know that migration was originally from the west to the east. In 800 BC, Samoa and Tonga were the first islands to be settled. Then many years later, in 1100 AD, Tahiti was the next island chain to be settled. And then comparatively a short time after that, about 100 years or so, in 1200 to 1300 AD, the remaining Pacific islands were settled. Those were the Marquesas, New Zealand, Hawaiian Islands, and Rapa Nui. So this really short time of rapid expansion is due to improved vessels and favorable winds, which we know now is called the El Nino effect. And this allowed the Polynesian people to really spread out throughout the rest of these islands and settle. Specifically for Hawaii, we know that there were 2 waves of people that settled on these islands. Through linguistic, archaeological, anthropological, and ethnobotanical research, it's suggested that Hawaii settlement first began by people from the Marquesas Islands, and then later on by Tahitians from the Society Islands. And during the second wave of people that were leaving Society Islands, they went to Hawaii as well as to Rapa Nui, which explains why there's similar oral history traditions and languages across these 3 cultures. So for a time, there was a theory that settlement was actually from the east to the west. So there was this guy named Thor Heyerdahl from Norway, and he thought that Polynesia was settled by people originally from South America. And he thought this because there was evidence of plants and like sweet potato and similar stone figures on from South America, as well as in some Polynesian islands. So he was actually doing some research in Marquesas, and an elder Marquesan man told him a story about his ancestors arriving from the east. So all of this put together, he thought that it could be very possible that Polynesian settlement actually came from the east and not the west, like everyone at the time thought. So to prove that this was possible, in 1947, he built a raft called the Kontiki, and he was able to sail from the western coast of Peru all the way to Tahiti without modern equipment. And while this journey showed that like this travel was possible, it wasn't enough evidence to really say that Polynesians settled from the east to the west. You really need concrete evidence to prove that, not just showing that, oh, it's possible, right? And through modern technologies like DNA testing, we see that Polynesians actually were in South America once, but it was because they continued from the west to the east, and then they actually went back to their islands after hitting South America. So this is why there is evidence of similarities like the plants and whatnot, because the Polynesians had contact with people in South America because they went to their lands, but then went back home. All right, so let's get into Polynesian languages. So we estimate that there's between 26 and 35 languages, and this is just because it's really difficult to define a dialect versus a language. It's very hazy to be able to say, oh, you're different enough to be a full-fledged language on your own, or you're too similar to another language to be a language and you're just a dialect. So there's no concrete number or consensus about that, but in the language family tree we have here, there are 35 languages. You'll see this word proto in front of a lot of language branch names. And a proto-language is a common ancestor language before it started dividing. So we don't really know what proto-languages are like. We just know what their descendants are like, because this is documentation we have and what we know people speak now. But we don't really have that proto-language documented or anything. We can guess from the descendants like what it could be like, but we just don't know. It was too long ago, and we'll never know what these proto-languages were like. But Proto-Polynesian was that single language way back in the day, and then because of all this spreading of the people, the language changed, right? So we have three main branches of Polynesian languages. We have the Proto-Tongic, Proto-Samoic outlier, and then we have the Proto-East Polynesian branches. And we can see how it really reflects the different times of settlement. We have Tongan and Samoan as kind of two main branches, and then we have the Eastern Polynesian as that kind of last settlement, right? And every language in each group we see like in the same branch, those are very similar. They're like sister languages basically. But then if it's in another branch, it's like a distant relative. I mean, you're still related, but you're not as close as what's within your language branch, okay? At one point in time, there was actually a theory of there only being one Polynesian language. And this came from the European explorers. So a long time ago, there was a guy named Tupaya, and he was a gifted linguist, a chief and priest from the Society Islands, so he was Tahitian. And he sailed with Captain James Cook in 1769 to 1770 to New Zealand and Australia. And he was able to communicate with the Maori people with whatever languages or language he knew. And the Europeans thought, oh, this guy is from Tahiti and he can speak with these guys that are Maori. They must be speaking the same language. This happened again with Hawaiians on Kauai when Cook's crew a few years later used Tahitian to communicate with the Hawaiians. So these things that happened to them, they thought that was evidence for one Polynesian language, just because, we're speaking, a language we learned from someone from a different island, and we're communicating with people from these islands, and they understand us. It must be the same. Well, we now understand that although languages were once similar, they've changed through time and developed into their own languages. So during the time of these explorations, the languages, the Tahitian language that Tupaya spoke, and the Maoris and Hawaiians that they encountered, it could have been more similar back in the day, but they were probably most likely different languages even then. And we don't know how exactly what they were saying to each other, right? Most likely they were using very basic words of communication and not like, you know, really proper grammar maybe. And so they could understand each other just because they are sister languages, but in fact, they aren't the same language. So all the things that I've just taught you about the settlement and the languages, how do we know this, right? Well, we can connect the dots through interdisciplinary studies. And when you have claims or theories in one field, it's really helpful to have other fields kind of assist you in saying, oh yeah, we found that in our field as well. So putting all these facts and things together can really give us a clearer picture of the past. So three fields I'm going to talk about now in relation to Polynesia are linguistics, archaeology, and anthropology. There are definitely other fields that have assisted in kind of forming our picture today of what Polynesia was like in the past, like botany and biology, but I'm just going to focus on these three. So first we have archaeology, which is a study of history through evacuation of sites and the analysis of physical remains. Archaeologists have found lapita pottery throughout the Pacific islands, and we know that it's an ancient Pacific culture that is a common ancestor to people in Polynesia, Micronesia, and part of Melanesia. We found out that it was this seafaring people originating in Taiwan, and they were the ones that spread out through the Pacific. So they found this pottery in Taiwan and also in other parts of the Pacific. And because of this, you can really connect those dots and say, oh, these people traveled throughout all of these lands. And a fun fact is that Lapita is the name of the site where the first pottery was found in New Caledonia. And then with modern techniques for archaeology, they use radiocarbon dating, also known as carbon-14 dating, to estimate the time these objects were first made. And then with that information, you can really get more detailed into timing and connecting those dots again between the different islands. The next field is anthropology. It's the study of culture, societies, and people and their development. So we have historical documentation by European travelers. A lot of these people, they kept diaries and extensive notes about their travels and interactions with different people in the cultures. So we have that information. Obviously, it is through like the eyes of Europeans. So some of it you have to take it with a grain of salt, just like that theory about one Polynesian language. But there are facts in there that can help us put those puzzle pieces together. There is a tradition of oral genealogies that are common throughout Polynesia islands, and that really helps us kind of connect things as well, like the stories about where people came from, and the common stories with throughout different islands. You can say, oh, these kind of are together or they're related somehow. More salient things is using modern technology again, like genetic anthropology. It's a very new field where they use DNA to study how people are connected. And then another thing that they've done is comparing bacterial samples of current human stomachs. I don't know too much about that, but all of these kind of more by like yeah, biological studies can really connect people from different lands. And now we come to linguistics. We're going to take a little deeper look at that. It's a scientific study of language. And in 1615, there was a Dutch voyage. There were two guys, Schouten and Lemery, and they had a crew, and everyone got sick. They got scurvy because they didn't have enough vitamin C, as the story goes, and they needed provisions. So this ship ended up landing on two different islands in Tonga, Cocos Island and Horn Island. And because of this landing, there was a guy on the ship, and he ended up recording 32 words of Tafahi and then 118 words from East Futuna. So immediately these word lists wasn't that useful to anybody, but almost 100 years later in 1706, there was this academic called Hadrian Roland, and he saw similarities between these word lists of these Polynesian islands and what he knew of Malayan languages. And it was kind of out there for him, because like these Polynesian islands and Malayan languages, which are in Southeast Asia and even all the way to Madagascar, they're so far away from each other. But he saw these similarities in vocabulary, and he thought, I think there's something going on here, and that these languages could be related to each other. So this theory actually was found true, and it became the Malayo-Polynesian language family, which is a subgroup of Austronesian. So to remind you what Austronesian languages look like, or where they are located, here is another map. And the yellow is where Polynesia would be, and then the purple is the Western Malayo-Polynesian languages. So that Roland guy, he knew something about these purple languages, and then he compared them to what you see in this yellow grouping, and he said, these are related. There's no way that they couldn't be related. And Malayo-Polynesian is everything on this map except for the green, and the green is Taiwan, and that's where those original peoples came from, and so their language is very different to what Malayo-Polynesian is like now, but that's where the languages originally came from. So for you to see what this Roland guy kind of saw, we have a list here of numbers from 1 to 10 in 5 different Malayo-Polynesian languages. First, here we have Horn Island, the language that we saw. There was that word list that the guy took way back in the day. And then Malagasy is spoken in Madagascar, which is, again, way out here, close to Africa. And then we have Polynesian nations, or Polynesian languages like Tongan, Rapa Nui, and Hawaiian. So just looking and just comparing visually, you can see that they're really, really similar, right, across all of these languages. The one that I'm always like amazed about is Lima, is the word for number 5, because it's in like all the Austronesian languages, and it's not very different. You say Lima and everyone knows it's 5. So this is what that guy Roland saw. He noticed that there's these similarities and came up with this theory that they must all be related somehow. Oh, so how do we know if languages are related? Well, there's 2 linguistic diagnostics. One is the one we're just talking about, the systematic comparison of features. Several types of data can be used, but one of the most common is comparing vocabulary. But you can also still compare like grammar, syntax, morphology, things like that. Cognates are words shared by languages that have come from a common source. The more cognates 2 languages share, the more closely related they are. And the second way to tell if languages are related is by using a mutual intelligibility test. And this just is where you see how much a speaker of one language can understand in another language. All right, so if we're looking at the Hawaiian language and we want to see what the closest relatives to Hawaiian is, we can use these diagnostics I just talked about. So the first one was that systematic comparison of features. This guy, Samuel Elbert, in 1952, he did a test among 20 Polynesian languages. So he looked at more than just cognates. He also looked at the grammar and stuff, but we're just looking at the cognates for this. So here's a list of the percentages of cognates shared with Hawaiian. And if we look, the highest percentage is Rarotonga and Tuamotu, with 79 and 77% of shared vocabulary. And then Maori over here is at 71%, which is really high as well. And if we compare this to what we know now about the Polynesian family tree, we see that they're in the same language branch. And then if we look at mutual intelligibility, in 1962, a guy named Jack Ward, he did a test for that compared to Hawaiian. And we see that the least intelligible language is Tongan with Hawaiian at 6.4%. And again, we do know that that's a very distant relative. So someone that speaks Tongan can only understand a little bit more than 6% of Hawaiian, whereas someone who spoke Marquesan or Tahitian would understand a great deal more. And that is because they are in the same language family branch. All right, so that is my presentation on Polynesian languages. Thank you and take care.